G&T show is intended for mature audiences. Parental discussion is advice. Live long and prosper, bitches.
Shall we just start right off the bat with a Las Vegas update?
Are we still talking Vegas, right?
We are.
Talking about Vegas.
Yes. You're coming to Vegas, right? Startrek Las Vegas may take place every August, but on this show...
This is where we hang out the rest of the year.
Exactly.
The crew has been fatigued now from so many months in space, and they need to take a break. The landing party has beamed down to check out the terrain while the crew gets ready to play. They say there's only plant life living on this lovely rock, but a rodent up here's wearing a vest.
Good morning. This is Janice Sanborn coming at you live from Shore Leave for the G&T show, and I am here with a special guest,
Michael Jan Friedman.
And we are going to do a small interview for all of the G&T listeners. So sit back, settle in, get your coffee, and enjoy. So good morning, and thank you for doing this with us.
My pleasure.
I know a lot of people ask how you get into writing, or how did you get into writing. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. I guess I'd wanted to be a writer since I was about 7, maybe, something like that. But I really didn't know anybody who did that. You know, I knew somebody did it, but I didn't know how or under what circumstances, and I really didn't think anybody did it for a job. You know, I said, well, they must do it, you know, when they're not doing something else. And then Isaac Asimov came to my campus when I was in college, and he said, yeah, I'm a full-time writer. And I'd heard of him, of course. I'd read his stuff, and I said, wow, that's really great. But I didn't ever think I'd do it. In fact, I remember telling people in college, if I can write one book, I'll die happy. Just let me write one book. And of course, now I've written 74.
Wow.
So I've raised the bar a little bit. But anyway, so I wanted to be a writer, but you know, I didn't really think I could. And in college, I did some writing. I would take independent studies and write fantasy novels, and my professors would always say, you should, you know, try and get this published. But then when I did, they said, well, you know, it's not quite there. But I had a humor column, a weekly humor column, and one of my friends in college, based on that, said, you know what, Mike, someday you're going to write a great novel, and I want to be your agent, because he came from a line of agents. He said, when you write your novel, you come to my family's agency, and I'm going to represent you. So I did. I wrote a novel, and I brought it to him, and he said, Mike, this could be the next great science fiction classic, or it could be a pile of horse manure. I have no idea. I don't read this stuff. He goes, so let me send you to somebody who does. Here's an agency that handles science fiction and fantasy. And so I called that agency, and I said, you know, I mean, I'm starting out. I have a novel. I'd like you to take a look at it. They said, well, you know, we're not looking at any new writers right now. And in my bravado, I said, don't you want the next Stephen King? And they said, well, we're actually very happy with the current Stephen King. So I did do one smart thing. I said, so tell me who else might represent new writers in the fantasy field. And they gave me a name, and I went to that agency, and that agency looked at my manuscript and said, yeah, we want to represent you. We'd like you to add a little here and there and change this little thing. And I did that willingly, gratefully. And they brought it to Warner Books. Warner was starting a new line called Questar, which was a science fiction and fantasy line. And they bought it right away. It was the first publisher who saw it, bought it. So that was very gratifying. And of course, I had a full-time job. I was working for a business magazine in Manhattan. And we went to lunch, my agent and I went to lunch with the editor who had bought the manuscript, a lady named Kathy Malley. And we went to a nice Italian restaurant, and Kathy said, so when can I have a sequel? And it took me 2 years to write the first one because I had a job, and I said, I don't know, it might take. And my agent kicked me under the table, and she said, when do you want it? And Kathy said, I'd like it by October. Well, it was April already, and my agent said, sure, that'll work. And afterwards, I said, "What did I get myself into here? I'm gonna do this in 6 months, and it took me 2 years to do the first one." So I had to cannibalize my job. I had to write the novel instead of working, and I would go in the bathroom and close the door and write longhand, and then later on I would go home and type it into my computer. So after a while, my boss said, Mike, not for nothing, but, you haven't done anything here for several weeks now. What's going on? And I said, well, you know what? You don't have to fire me. I'm going to go. Just give me another couple of weeks. So they didn't want to pay me unemployment, so they did. They let me go for a couple of weeks, and I was just working on my book. And then I left, and of course I had now had no visible means of income, but I was almost finished with the book. And I turned that in, and when I turned that in, Kathy Malley said, well, you got 2 books now, let's make it a trilogy. So I started working on that one, and all of a sudden, before I knew it, I was a freelance writer. And that's pretty much how it started.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's an incredible voyage. I would have been like, yes! Oh.
So after that, the biggest thing that happened soon after that was my editor said to me, would you like to write a Star Trek book? And I had read a few, by Howie Weinstein and Ann Crispin, and I enjoyed them. And it hadn't really occurred to me to write one, but I said, that's going to be a lot of fun, my God. I can sit there and put words in Spock's mouth and Kirk's mouth. Oh, that'll be great. Writing dialogue for those guys, terrific. So I came up with a story that was kind of Scotty-centric, and I submitted it to Dave Stern, who was the editor there, who had read my other books and told my agent that he'd like to see, an outline. So I sent him the outline, and he hated it. He said, this is not at all what I'm looking for. He goes, it's fantasy. And I said, yeah, but you liked my fantasy. And he goes, yeah, but this is science fiction. Write me a science fiction outline. So I went back to the drawing board, and I wrote him a science fiction outline. And this one he liked very much. And this became my first Star Trek book, which was called Double Double. It was it was a sort of a sequel to the episode What a Little Girl's Made Of, the original series episode, and with androids and so on, and it was it was a pleasure to do, and I was very happy with it when we were done.
So what did you find was different between fantasy and sci-fi?
Well, fantasy only has to be internally consistent, and science fiction has to be consistent with scientific concepts. But Star Trek, I have to say, Star Trek, there was a fantasy element there, because they were dealing with sciences that were so far advanced, it was almost like fantasy. But the biggest difference was going from books that I was writing purely out of my imagination to licensed properties. Star Trek being somebody's property. At the time, Paramount owned it. So normally a writer would have one level of approval, and that would be the editor. In the case of Star Trek books, especially at the time, there was more than one level of approval. In fact, there were 3. There was the editor, of course, and then there were 2 levels of approval at Paramount for a little while. After Gene Roddenberry died, one of those levels went away, and it was just the licensing department, and they were very nice, creative, intelligent people, and I was always able to work something out with them where there was something they objected to. They always had a good idea for how to resolve it. So it was, it was in every way, it was a labor of love, but it was interesting having that extra layer of approval.
So it must have been different too, because when you're writing just purely your own stories, you're creating the characters.
Mm-hmm.
With Star Trek, you are working with characters that are already created, and maybe adding a few in.
Right.
But they all have to be able to relate in some way.
You have to be able to put them all back in the sandbox when you're done playing with the toys. In some ways, that's harder because you have somebody else who's an expert telling you, no, the character wouldn't do that. At different points they said things like, I had a character putting something in his pocket. They said our characters don't have pockets. So I said, okay, they don't. All right, I guess they're the experts. So we found another way to do it. But so you have to go along with the expertise of the people who own the franchise. But at the same time, it's also easier in some ways because there's a lot you don't have to establish. The characters are already established, the settings are established, the political situation's established, and now you can just play off it. And there's something nice about that too. I enjoy that as well.
So what are the current books that you have?
Most recently, I've been writing my own fiction. About 5 years ago, some other writers and I started an independent writers group, and we publish as a group. It's called Crazy 8 Press, and I'm wearing the shirt right now. And at Crazy 8 Press, we publish our purest visions. I'll give you an example of what I couldn't publish traditionally. I had an idea as the Mesoamerican calendar was coming to a close a few years ago. I had an idea for a 21st century Aztec Empire murder mystery.
Wow. Right?
It's going to be a detective for the emperor, and it's a murder mystery in that milieu. The idea being that hundreds of years earlier, Cortez failed to conquer Mexico. So when I showed that to an editor at Del Rey, she said, "I love this idea. I want to read this." I said, "But I can't buy it because I can't imagine going to a bookstore buyer and saying, yeah, this is a 21st century Aztec Empire murder mystery." His head will explode. So he won't, well, where do I put it in this store? So these are the things that we really want to do, but for one reason or another, we can't. Editors, with people reading less, editors have to hit on every book. They can't afford to even miss one. And in some cases, you see editors being very conservative, most cases, where they would rather have a lot of small victories than a big one and take a chance on it, because that could also involve a failure. They can't afford any failure, so they play it very close to the vest, more and more. And for us, that's not necessary. We don't have to make those kinds of numbers. We can do something out of the box. We're kind of trying to appeal to the reader who's seen everything down the middle of the road and wants something that's different. And those are the things we want to write, and those are the things we want the reader to have a chance to read, because things are changing in the marketplace. Bookstores are going out of business. The whole Borders chain went out. That was huge. And it all has to do with people reading less. Publishers are also having trouble, and in many cases they have to reinvent themselves because even though they're getting some help from ebooks, the sale of ebooks, the more ebooks they sell, the more they cripple their main channel of distribution, which is the bookstore. So they're kind of helping themselves as they hurt themselves, and the bookstores are struggling, not just independents but chains as well. So at Crazy 8, we wanted to make sure that we preserved the relationship between the writer and the reader. That's where the magic happens. And everything else is just a necessary evil, really. So we go direct. Our readers can buy our books on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com, physical books or ebooks, or they can go to our website and order the books there. But it's a way of ensuring that we continue to have that relationship with the reader, because without that, we're at a loss, and so is the reader.
Well, maybe it also inspire people to read more.
Mm-hmm.
Because in today's day and age, mostly what we're reading are small snippets of information or pieces of a blog, or, just it's got to be quick and it's got to be bullet points. There's
Right.
no intrinsic detail hidden in there. So to sit and read a whole book.
Yeah. It's true. People are being trained. It's the MTV generation, and people are being trained to read shorter and shorter items, which, in a way is okay, because we, there's nothing that says the optimal piece of fiction has to be 70 or 80,000 words. It could be 500 words. So in a way, the internet is giving us a lot of opportunities, while it kind of took away from us, from our livelihoods, in terms of offering potential readers other ways of entertaining themselves through the whole technology boom, gave them video games and computer games and just messing around on the internet. It's distracting from the possibility of reading a book. But it also gave us all kinds of opportunities. Without the internet, we at Crazy 8 Press could never provide books for readers, because until 10 years ago, or not too much more than that, we didn't have the means of distribution. We didn't have the means of marketing, and we didn't have the means of production. So right now we have the same advantages, really, that a major publisher has. The only thing we can't offer is an advance, and advances are getting so small anyway. Who cares?
This is a question that I've asked several people.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you could take a character, any storyline, does not have to be Star Trek, and place them in a holodeck program, which character would it be, and what holodeck program?
Which character and what program? Well, as a writer, I get to do stuff like that all the time.
Easy.
I have my 21st century Aztec Empire detective. I have the son of Odin who survives Ragnarok. The Greek demigod who winds up a police detective in the 21st century. So I do that all the time. But so you're saying if I could interact with somebody on a holodeck, who would I want it to be?
You would take one of your characters and you're going to drop them into...
One of my characters?
Right, and you're going to drop them into a holodeck program.
Oh, one of my characters who I would like to meet in a holodeck program. Oh my God, there are so many. Let me think for a second. I think it would be Tim Cruise. And who's Tim Cruise? Tim Cruise is the protagonist of a book I wrote about a year ago called I Am the Salamander. And it's a kid who's suffering from cancer and suddenly goes into remission. It's a miracle. Can't figure out why. And shortly after that, he begins to change. His appearance changes on and off. And he develops these strange abilities. He can see outside the normal human visible spectrum. He can climb walls. He can shoot toxins out of a slit in his head, and not all these things at once, but he can do this, then he can do this, then he can do this, and he changes colors, and he realizes he's taking on the abilities of salamanders. He would be an interesting person. I feel a stronger kinship with him than with some of my other characters. And maybe that's the reason I told the book in the first person. But I Am the Salamander is, the hero of I Am the Salamander is somebody I'd probably like to read. He's very human. And what I had in mind there is going back to Fantastic Four #1. When the Fantastic Four got their powers, when they discovered that they'd changed as a result of being exposed to cosmic radiation, whatever that might be, they were horrified. Terrified. The Invisible Girl looked at herself and said, "Oh my God, will I always be invisible?" And the Thing, of course, is this pile of orange rocks. And then the Human Torch, he's on fire. I'm on fire. This can't be a good thing, right? So he...
this presents complications.
Right? So they're horrified. This is the last thing they want to happen. And that's what takes place in I Am the Salamander. He's horrified by what's happening. His body betrayed him when he was sick. That's how he felt, like his body was betraying him. And now it's doing it again. And he doesn't know why or what the ultimate change is going to be. So it's a cool book. I'm very happy with it. And if you look at the cover, the expression on his face, he's completely horrified at what's happening to him. Because he's a kid, he's a teenager. Teenagers don't want to be different. They want to be the same.
Yes.
They want to fit in. So.
Unless they're renegade.
Yeah, right.
And then that would be bad news. Last question.
Okay.
What sage advice would you give just general listeners and readers out there? It's just general advice. It's not how you're going to write a novel or anything like that, but just on living.
Oh, my God. Well, first of all, you're asking me for sage advice?
Sage advice.
Wow, because, my kids don't do that. Let's see. What kind of advice? I think, one thing I would say to people is don't let others define you. When I was in college, again, taking these creative writing classes and doing independent studies, I remember in the first creative writing class I did, people were tearing each other up. And at first I thought, well, that's good. It's criticism. But then I realized it was just vicious. And there were one or two people in the class who'd never said anything. And I said, why are they not? And then I realized it's because they weren't there to tear other people down. They were the good writers in the class. And they refused to let other people define them. One guy got up at the end of the class and he said, well, I guess we all know that, we have a future in accounting. And maybe he did, but I didn't. I refused to accept his definition of me. And I think that's important for people. Have a vision of what you want to do and be, and do it. And don't let anybody tell you that you can't or that's not you. Define yourself. That's my sage advice.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to do this interview for the G&T show. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Music for the G&T show is provided by Warp 11, Andrew Allen, Grethor, and 5 Year Mission. This has been a Busy Little Beaver production.
Some dude walks out, proceeds to explain what it's all about. I sure want to leave. I think you'd agree, but we cannot leave till we find out what it's all about. It's all make-believe, nothing is permanent down here. It's just an amusement park. Bones is now alive, so it's okay for him to say, I'm a doctor, not a shish kebab. Apparently it's okay if we trust an unknown race who can come true.